May 1940. France is collapsing. Nazi Germany has crushed Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Britain stands alone. Winston Churchill becomes prime minister and knows Britain cannot win without American help. President Franklin Roosevelt stands before Congress and announces production targets that sound insane. 185,000 aircraft, 120,000 tanks, 55,000 anti-aircraft guns, 18 million tons of merchant shipping, all in 2 years. Adolf Hitler's advisors tell him this is American propaganda, impossible. In 1939, annual aircraft production for the U.S. military was less than 3,000 planes. America's military ranks 18th in the world, smaller than Romania's. Hitler believes America is weak. He's convinced Americans are too soft, too divided, too focused on profits to mobilize for war. He's catastrophically wrong. By the end of World War II, American factories will have produced 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 193,000 artillery pieces, 2 million army trucks, and built or launched more ships than all other nations combined. America will supply 2/3 of all Allied military equipment. By 1944, over half of all industrial production in the world will happen in the United States. This is the story of how America won the economic war before D-Day even happened. Let's start with oil, because oil was everything. Modern war in the 1940s ran on petroleum. Ships, planes, tanks, trucks, all required fuel. Armies without oil couldn't move. Air forces without oil couldn't fly. Navies without oil were floating targets. In 1940, the United States produced 1.35 billion barrels of oil per year. That was 63% of total world production. Let me repeat that. America alone produced nearly 2/3 of all the oil on Earth. Germany produced almost none. Japan produced almost none. The Axis powers were oil-starved from day one. Germany got oil from 2 sources. Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, which produced about 5.5 million tons annually, and synthetic fuel plants that converted coal into gasoline using a chemical process called hydrogenation. In 1940, synthetic fuel provided 22% of Germany's supply. By 1943, it reached 52%. But synthetic fuel was expensive and required massive amounts of coal and energy to produce. Germany's total oil consumption in 1940 was about 8 million tons. By 1945, it had dropped 86%. The Wehrmacht, Germany's army, was running on empty. In the final year of the war, German tanks were pulled to runways by horses and oxen because there wasn't enough fuel to drive them. Japan was even worse. Japan had virtually no domestic oil production. Small fields at Niigata and Akita produced trivial amounts. Japan imported 90% of its oil, and 80% of that came from the United States. When the U.S. imposed an oil embargo in July 1941 after Japan invaded Indochina, Japan faced a choice: submit or seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and Indonesia. Japan chose war. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was fundamentally about oil. Japan needed to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet so it could conquer Southeast Asia and control the Dutch East Indies oil fields, which produced 65 million barrels annually. Japan succeeded in the short term. By early 1942, Japan controlled the Dutch East Indies. But here's the problem. Japan couldn't transport the oil. American submarines targeted Japanese tankers relentlessly. By 1943, Japan's oil imports peaked and then collapsed. In 1944, petroleum supply to Japan was cut in half. By 1945, it had dried up completely. American submarines sank over 50% of all Japanese ships during the war, most of them tankers and cargo vessels. Without oil, Japan's navy couldn't sail. Its air force couldn't fly. The Japanese military resorted to kamikazes, partly because they didn't have enough fuel for round trips. Meanwhile, America had a massive surplus. U.S. oil production in 1940 was 3.7 million barrels per day. By 1945, it had risen to 4.7 million barrels per day. America produced more than enough to fuel its own military and supply its allies. The U.S. provided over 85% of all oil used by the Allies during the war. That's 6 billion barrels total, equal to all U.S. oil production from the first well drilled in 1859 through 1941. Without American oil, Britain and the Soviet Union would have lost. Russian factories would have stopped. British ships would have been stranded. American technology made the oil even more valuable. German Messerschmitt fighters used 87-octane aviation fuel made from coal hydrogenation. British Spitfires used 100-octane gasoline supplied by America, produced using catalytic cracking technology pioneered in the 1930s. The higher octane fuel gave Allied planes better engine performance. This was critical in the Battle of Britain. Inferior British planes outperformed superior German aircraft because American fuel gave them more power. U.S. production of 100-octane aviation gasoline went from 40,000 barrels per day in 1940 to 514,000 barrels per day in 1945. Oil was so critical that Germany invaded the Soviet Union partly to seize oil fields. Operation Barbarossa in June 1941 aimed to capture the Caucasus oil fields at Maikop, Grozny, and Baku. Hitler told Mussolini, "The life of the Axis depends on those oil fields." By late 1942, Hitler wrote, "Unless we get the Baku oil, the war is lost." Germany never captured Baku. The Wehrmacht got as far as Stalingrad but was stopped and pushed back. Germany's oil shortage became catastrophic. By early 1945, German aviation fuel production had dropped to 0.5% of 1944 levels. New Luftwaffe pilots got only 110 hours of flight training compared to 240 hours in 1942 and 350 hours for British and American pilots. Undertrained German pilots were slaughtered. Germany had advanced jet fighters by 1945, but no fuel to fly them. The war was lost because Germany ran out of oil. Now let's talk about industrial production. Before Pearl Harbor, American industry was still recovering from the Great Depression. Unemployment in 1939 was 17.2%. Factories were underutilized. The military was tiny. Then Roosevelt set those impossible-sounding production goals in May 1940. Hitler's advisors laughed. They were wrong. American industry transformed almost overnight. The numbers are staggering. In 1939, U.S. military aircraft production was under 3,000 planes. By the end of the war, America had produced 300,000 aircraft. In 1944 alone, America built more planes than Japan built during the entire war. Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan, built specifically to manufacture B-24 Liberator bombers, had an assembly line over 1 mile long. The plant produced one complete B-24 every 63 minutes at peak efficiency. Each B-24 had 1.55 million parts. Compare that to a Ford car with 15,000 parts. By 1945, Ford had built 8,865 B-24s at Willow Run alone. Tank production went from 331 units in 1940 to 29,497 in 1943. Ships were built so fast that by autumn 1943, all Allied shipping sunk since 1939 had been replaced. America launched more vessels in 1941 than Japan launched during the entire war. Shipbuilder Henry Kaiser used innovative assembly techniques to mass-produce Liberty ships. His shipyards produced 2,751 Liberty ships between 1941 and 1945. At peak, Kaiser's yards launched one ship every day. Merchant shipyards, overseen by the U.S. Maritime Commission, produced 5,777 ships total, at a cost of $13 billion. After the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Japan built 6 aircraft carriers in the following 3 years. America built 17. The disparity was overwhelming. American industry provided almost 2/3 of all Allied military equipment during the war. 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, 2 million army trucks. Britain and the Soviet Union combined couldn't match American output. How did America do this? Several factors. First, geography. America was safe from bombing. German and Japanese forces never threatened the continental United States. Factories could operate 24 hours a day without fear of air raids. European and Soviet factories were constantly bombed or threatened. Soviet factories had to be evacuated eastward to the Urals, away from German advances. This disrupted production. American factories faced no such problems. Second, natural resources. America had everything: oil, coal, iron, copper, aluminum. Factories didn't depend on imports. Germany and Japan had to import raw materials, and Allied blockades cut off those supplies. Third, existing industrial capacity. Before the war, America was already the world's largest economy. GDP in 1939 was higher than Germany, Japan, Britain, and France combined. When that industrial base mobilized for war, the output was unstoppable. Fourth, innovation. American companies invented new manufacturing techniques. Albert Kahn designed the Detroit Arsenal tank plant and Ford's Willow Run plant specifically for mass production. Open floor space allowed assembly lines to run efficiently. Chrysler's tank plant had tracks installed directly on the factory floor. Henry Kaiser pioneered sub-assembly techniques for ships. Components were built separately and assembled quickly, cutting production time dramatically. Fifth, workforce mobilization. Unemployment dropped from 14.6% in 1940 to 1.9% by 1945. Women entered the workforce in massive numbers. Sixth, government coordination. Roosevelt created the War Production Board in 1942 and the Office of War Mobilization in 1943 to coordinate production. The Petroleum Administration for War worked with oil companies to accelerate extraction and refining. Civilian industries converted to military production. Automobile manufacturers stopped making cars entirely. In 1941, over 3 million cars were produced in the United States. From 1942 to 1945, production of civilian cars dropped to almost zero. Instead, General Motors made airplane engines, guns, trucks, and tanks. Packard made Rolls-Royce engines for the British Air Force. Chrysler made fuselages. The entire auto industry shifted to war production. Companies that made farm equipment converted to military vehicles. Letourneau, which made tractors and industrial equipment, began producing combat engineering vehicles. Innovations came from unexpected places. M&M's candy was invented in 1941 with a hard shell that prevented chocolate from melting. The military bought M&M's exclusively to ship to troops in hot climates. Motorola produced over 130,000 handy-talkie radios, the first truly handheld communication devices. Every American infantry unit at Normandy carried them. Seventh, Lend-Lease. Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor. This allowed America to provide military equipment to Britain and other allies without requiring immediate payment. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. sent $50 billion worth of supplies through Lend-Lease. Britain received $31.4 billion. The Soviet Union received $11.2 billion. This included aircraft, tanks, trucks, food, oil, steel, chemicals, and industrial machinery. The Soviets received hundreds of thousands of American trucks, which vastly enhanced the mobility of Soviet ground forces. American machine tools helped Soviet factories produce weapons. Without Lend-Lease, Britain and the Soviet Union might have lost. Churchill called it the most unsordid act in history. Stalin admitted Soviet victory would have been impossible without American supplies. The economic dominance was so complete that it changed the balance of world power permanently. Before the war, Britain was the world's financial center. The pound sterling was the reserve currency. After the war, America held 60% of the world's monetary gold. The dollar replaced sterling as the reserve currency. New York replaced London as the financial capital. American corporations dominated global trade. The Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 formalized this. The dollar became the anchor of the international monetary system. America emerged from the war as the world's undisputed superpower, not just militarily, but economically. U.S. GDP had doubled during the war. By 1944, government spending was 79% of GDP compared to 30% in 1941. Industrial production had expanded massively. At war's end, over half of all global industrial production happened in America. Germany and Japan never had a chance. Their economies were smaller, their resources were limited, their oil supplies were inadequate. America outproduced them in every category: aircraft, tanks, ships, ammunition, fuel. The numbers aren't even close. America produced 41 billion rounds of ammunition during the war. That's more bullets than the rest of the world combined. American industrial output was so overwhelming that General Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, credited shipbuilder Andrew Higgins as the man who won the war for producing landing craft. Eisenhower understood that logistics, not tactics, determined outcomes. You can't fight without supplies. You can't move without fuel. You can't win without industrial production. And America had more of all three than everyone else combined. Donald Douglas, founder of Douglas Aircraft Company, captured it perfectly. Here's proof that free men can outproduce slaves. Roosevelt told Congress, "Powerful enemies must be outfought and outproduced. It is not enough to turn out just a few more planes, a few more tanks, a few more guns, a few more ships than can be turned out by our enemies." America didn't just outproduce the Axis by a little, it crushed them. The economic war was won before D-Day, before the Battle of the Bulge, before the atomic bombs. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, Germany was already losing. Not because of tactics or strategy, because Germany was out of fuel, out of supplies, and facing an enemy with infinite industrial capacity. American factories were producing weapons faster than Germany could destroy them. Every plane shot down was replaced by 10 more. Every tank destroyed was replaced by 20. Germany couldn't keep up. The lesson is brutal and simple. Modern industrial war is won by economics, not heroism. Brave soldiers matter. Brilliant generals matter. But industrial production matters more. The side that produces more wins. The side that runs out of oil loses. Germany had better tanks than America. The German Panther and Tiger tanks were superior to American Shermans. but Germany produced 6,000 Panthers. America produced 50,000 Shermans. Quantity beat quality. Germany had jet fighters in 1944, years ahead of the Allies. But Germany couldn't fuel them. They sat on runways while American P-51 Mustangs controlled the skies. Japan had skilled pilots and advanced tactics early in the war. But American industry replaced losses faster than Japan could inflict them. By 1944, Japanese pilots were undertrained teenagers, flying obsolete planes with no fuel. American pilots flew brand new aircraft with full tanks. The economic war teaches another lesson. Geography is destiny. America's location between two oceans, far from enemies, made it invulnerable to bombing. Factories operated safely. Resources flowed freely. Germany and Japan had no such advantage. They were surrounded by enemies. Their factories were bombed. Their supply lines were cut. They fought at a permanent disadvantage. Finally, the economic war shows the importance of resources, oil especially. Germany tried synthetic fuel. It wasn't enough. Japan tried conquering oil fields. American submarines sank the tankers. The Axis lost because they couldn't fuel their war machines. America won because it had more oil than the rest of the world combined. And America used that oil to power the greatest industrial mobilization in history. By the time American troops stormed the beaches at Normandy, the war was already won. The shooting was just confirming what the factories had decided. America's economic dominance was so complete that victory was inevitable. Hitler should have listened to his advisors who warned him America's production targets were real. But dictators don't listen. And so Germany fought a war it couldn't win against an enemy it couldn't match. The economic war was over before the shooting even started. America had already won.